War of the Worlds is usually thought of as the first in the alien invasion genre, though Two Planets was published the same year and The Germ Growers preceded both by a few years, all of which are tied in with the invasion literature around that time, particularly in Britain about fictional wars with France or Germany rather than extraterrestrials. But related to the alien invasion idea is a more subtle alternative. The alien incursion, the idea of an extraterrestrial population assimilating, infiltrating, or supplanting us. Alien Nation is a great example of the analogy for immigration version of this, with hundreds of thousands of alien laborers falling out of the sky and settling in Los Angeles. There are similar themes in some of the Planet of the Apes films, but they'll get their own video. We can even count Superman here, with the alien child Kal-El blending into his adopted culture, projecting the Clark Kent persona as an act of deliberate outward assimilation while still remaining forever something else. But District 9 really grabs onto several threads and tangles them up in some interesting ways. So we begin with a documentary-style backstory. An alien spacecraft arrives, takes up position over Johannesburg, and just sits there for months. All attempts at contact fail, so the South African government, and really the international community, does what anyone would eventually do with a mysterious box of potential goodies left on the porch. Cut it open and see what's inside. And what they find is filth and squalor. A million malnourished, disgusting bug people living in shit. There's echoes here of books like The Camp of the Saints and Fugue for a Darkening Island, novels from the 1970s that depict swarms of third world immigrants packed into freighters, pouring into France and the UK, respectively. District 9 starts with that same setup, only the third worlders are off-worlders, and their arrival in apartheid South Africa, a country itself ruled by a minority population, adds more layers to it. One of the layers being that these aliens, which for convenience I'll refer to by the film's racial slur for them, prawns.
I mean, you can't say they don't look like that. That's what they look like, right? They look like prawns.
The prawns don't have much choice in being there, it seems. Certainly not once they're taken off the ship down to the surface and concentrated into a shantytown. They're not human looking enough to assimilate into our culture. They didn't come to conquer or colonize. They're just here. District 9 shows us an immigration story, but one where the newly arrived population isn't just foreign, but alien. Peaceful coexistence is possible, but assimilation is not. At least, not in a direction favoring the human population already there. Meet Wikus, government functionary and nepotism beneficiary.
I had to put aside the fact that my daughter was married to Wikus. That didn't factor in my decision to promote her.
The government has decided that the prawn ghetto is too close to where people live and is going to relocate them to new facilities further away. But the international community isn't going to just round them up and ship them off to a big concentration camp. They have to think about the optics, and that sort of thing looks bad.
We've built a nice new facility where the prawn can go, he can be comfortable, he can stay there. The people of Johannesburg and of South Africa are going to live happily and safely knowing that that prawn is very far away.
The relocation is going to be voluntary-ish.
You just put your scroll there. Okay, all right, Thomas, hold it. We've got the scroll there because as he hit it, that's what I was saying. It counts as a scroll.
Also, token bribes. For example, the prawn's favorite foods.
Oh, that's a pity because you know this. Well, this is a nice cat food, you know. But of course, it's not your house, eh? So we'll just have to go and give it to someone else. We need you to sign there. Okay, there it is. Now you can take that. Oh, okay, all right. Thomas, wait. Take it easy, my friend.
This bit is even funnier now than it was at the time.
Free fries when you get vaccinated? I got vaccinated. You're saying I could get this? These delicious fries?
But the point here is that Wikus isn't a hero. He's not a villain either. He's too spineless for that. He's just some guy with a clipboard making sure the paperwork is in order before relocating an entire undesirable population. But he's in for a surprise.
But I don't trust it. You know, I don't trust anything that...
You're right, Rick. Wikus, you're right.
He starts to transform into one of them. Now, there are multiple layers to this. The obvious one, the transformation into the marginalized group. Clearly, his perception of the world changes as he shifts from favored middle management of the ruling group to part of the underclass. There are plenty of long essays on that are already out there. It's boilerplate progressivism at this point. More interesting is his commodification. The alien technology is somehow biologically coded to them. It's all just inert metal for humans. But when they discover that Wikus is able to operate that technology, he ceases to be treated as a man and instead is seen as property.
He became the most valuable business artifact on Earth.
But his real value was that he could operate alien weaponry.
But this isn't the part that most grabs my attention either. I'll leave the full dive into the Marxist interpretation of that to ideologues who will do it in complete earnest with a straight face. What I find more interesting about it is how it frames the story in terms of a simple race allegory, but then contradicts that race-based worldview at every turn, revealing how artificial the whole concept is if we peel back the layers. The intro sequence of the film has a few clips of what locals think about the prawns living nearby.
They're spending so much money to keep them here when they could be spending it on other things, but at least they're keeping them separate from us.
It's been said that they were actually asked about Nigerian immigrants. Whether or not that's actually the case, the movie struck a nerve. The Nigerian government actually banned it over its depiction of a Nigerian gang operating in the prawn ghetto, with enterprises like reselling cat food at extortionate markups, trading for alien weapons that notably they can't even use, and selling prawn body parts for consumption in order to absorb their power.
You must eat them. And their power will live in you.
There's also a little bit of cannibalism. Much ink was spilled over its insensitive treatment of an entire nation, and I get why Nigerian people got a bit cross about it. But also, maybe there's a little thou doth protest too much about it at work. I first took it not as an attack on Nigerians in general, but rather on drug cartels, gun runners, and cannibal witch doctors that just happened to be Nigerian in this story because it was set in South Africa and the immigration from Nigeria was an issue. As the film's director Neil Blomkamp explains, the Nigerian thing is there because I wanted to take as many cues from South Africa as I could. I wanted South Africa to be the inspiration. If I try to keep South Africa as true to South Africa as I could, then unfortunately a massive part of the crime that happens in Johannesburg is by Nigerians there. It's just the way it is. I wanted to have a crime group and thought the most honest refraction of a crime group would be Nigerians for one. And then secondly, the Muti, the African witch doctor, is also a huge part of Africa in many African countries. So I wanted to incorporate that as well. At the time I was writing the movie, there was all these tribal witch doctor attacks on albino, because albino flesh were worth more than normal humans. That was the analogy to a different group or a different race, with their traditional medicine or traditional muti, even cannibalism in some instances. I incorporated aliens into that. I bring this up because, to American eyes, Nigerians and black South Africans are generally seen as the same race. We have a social construct of race derived from broad ethnicity and lump all Africans together as black despite significant tribal and cultural differences. Africa is really big, but not big enough, it seems, to escape the blanket of this idea of race. And historically, we can see this modern idea of race being constructed through legal documents and language. Really starting with Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when many in the Virginia colony, including white indentured servants, black slaves, and free Negroes, all fought together against the colonial governor. It wasn't some idealistic multicultural thing. The rebels wanted to drive the native tribes out and take their land to homestead. But this class consciousness, to use an anachronistic term, was seen as a problem. And so divisions were nurtured and reinforced. The terms black and white become common in legal documents as distinctions of ethnically identified social status, creating big catch-all categories that divide people. But with District 9, Wikus is transracial. He's not doing the white savior thing, and he's not wearing prawn face. He's actually transforming physically into an example of a different group, though still culturally a white man from South Africa. And now that he's essentially become property, he needs a place to hide and he needs allies. The only place to find either is in District 9 with the prawns. Of course, there's a mass media angle here too, not only in plastering his face on every screen, but also planting bogus stories to discredit him in the eyes of the public.
Wikus van der Merwe was recently apprehended after prolonged sexual activity with aliens in District 9.
Going for that visceral disgust to taint anything he might reveal about illegal activities of the government. You can't trust that Wikus guy. He's a filthy, lying prawn fucker. How else would he end up like that? Later on, the film condenses down into more of a straight-up sci-fi action story. Gunfights with mechs, exploding vehicles, exploding people, all that cool stuff. And through it all, Wikus goes from being completely self-interested, just trying to get a cure so he can be human again, to an act of self-sacrifice to help his prawn friend and his little kid.
Thank you, boy, and go home. You have to make it. Don't make me go through all of this and not make it. You understand?
This little gamer kid taking on the gangsters with a drone is even more interesting in retrospect. I like that little murder roach. Little dude's one of the exceptions. Almost every character in this thing is foul in some way. The only two that really seem like decent people in this thing are the wife, mostly because she doesn't do anything vile, and his assistant, who ends up in prison for revealing the brutal experiments that were being done on prawns. Both are such small roles that I can't remember either of the characters' names. Even the prawn identified as Christopher, the one that works with Wikus towards common goals, bails on his people and absconds with a ship. And Wikus, now fully transformed, lives among them. It's all rather ominous at the end.
We don't know if he was simply escaping, whether he will effect a rescue plan, and as the so-called Free Press says, whether or not he'll come back and declare war on us.
Between that possibility, the existence of a compound that transforms humans into prawns, or just the growing population that can never be fully assimilated nor sent back, there's again echoes of Camp of the Saints and Fugue for a Darkening Island, foreshadowing something horrific, whether open war, an inexorable population replacement, or a solution of another sort. But also, just maybe, a possibility of all these different tribes, let's say, to get away from the idea of race, all these tribes sharing the same general space. In the case of this story, the black South Africans, the white South Africans, the Nigerians, and the prawns, each a large but distinct cultural group. And if we try to map them over categories of black and white, it ends up in nonsense. And this is important to keep in mind when looking at contemporary politics and recent history. All right, let's talk about Rhodesia. It's usually framed in terms of a black majority fighting against a ruling white minority for fair representation. One man, one vote, as was often said. It's also sometimes framed in terms of a Moscow-backed communist insurgency against a colonial government. And while there's some truth to both of these interpretations, neither of them really captures the reality. It makes much more sense to think of it in terms of tribes or cultural groups vying for dominance. The principal black nationalist groups, the Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Zimbabwe African National Union, were primarily tribal cluster groups. ZANU was mostly Shona, while ZAPU was mostly Ndebele. There are numerous divisions within both groups, of course, but the Shona collectively make up a significant majority of the total population and the largest of the nationalist groups. Robert Mugabe was Shona, and the country has been ruled by that tribal majority ever since his party, or rather his tribal cluster, took power. That has determined which cultural traditions the schools teach and which are suppressed, how land is redistributed, how power is allocated. Rhodesia, dominated by the Anglo group, was replaced by Zimbabwe, dominated by the Shona tribal group. This is definitely the Cliff's Notes version of what happened there. In a tribal society, one man, one vote translates to the biggest tribe makes the rules, and only the big tribes want it. The modern Western liberal idea of the individual participating in pluralistic government doesn't translate to a society based on hierarchies of family and tribal affiliations, and trying to impose it on them is one of the most paternalistic, colonialist things you can do to them. The result wasn't transforming colonial rule Rhodesia into democratic Zimbabwe, but rather the replacement of one ruling tribe with another. Whatever else anyone chooses to map onto it, whether race or ideology, that collective group identity, that tribalism, is the core of it. But why am I talking about Rhodesia in a District 9 video? At least South Africa would be applicable, right? Well, I'm deliberately shifting away from South Africa for this reason. If we're going to treat the prawns as an allegory for real-world racism, who are they? Who are they the closest stand-in for? We could compare them to the native black population in that they're poor, they're treated as inferior, they're shoved aside as inconvenient and unwanted. But we could also compare them to the white population. They're relatively recent arrivals. They're a minority. The international community is actively working to contain and undermine them. Or perhaps they're most analogous to Angolans, Zambians, etc. that went to Rhodesia or South Africa for work opportunities. Despite their second-class status in those countries, it was still a step up from where they were. Trying to frame it in terms of racial motivations leads to asking the wrong questions. Why would someone move to South Africa to be oppressed? Well, obviously they went there in spite of apartheid, not because of it. And we can look at, for example, the Camp of the Saints as a horrendously racist story about dirty foreigners ruining a nice white country, or we can tie it to replacement theory as a paranoid fantasy of the far right, yet War of the Worlds is an insightful commentary on colonialism, and District 9 is a critique of racism, or just racist if you're a Nigerian. But they're all stories built on the same core idea. A bunch of people come uninvited from somewhere else and conflict ensues to the detriment of everyone. Race is a framing device that can be used to manipulate the audience. Group A are oppressed and need help. Group B is mean and selfish. Apportion your sympathies accordingly. Consider, District 9 is War of the Worlds as told through the eyes of an anti-racist activist. I know, the prawns aren't trying to conquer the earth. What I'm saying is that if we retold War of the Worlds, but from the perspective of the Martians desperately trying to survive, fleeing their dying planet and hoping to find a new life on our thriving world with so much to offer, think of the little Martian children and all that, it would look a lot like District 9. Race is a narrative, a story, one told to enhance divisions and often animosity. And insofar as the idea of race has been equated with ethnicity and sets of cultural expectations, everybody is racist, at least a little bit. People generally feel most comfortable around others they perceive as being like themselves. And this idea of race has become so woven into our perceptions that we don't think about it being a deliberately constructed thing. It becomes an integral part of the like me or not like me perception, by design on some level. Or put another way, the prawns are a dirty, violence-prone bunch of disgusting bug people. Just look at them. But Christopher is a guy we can relate to because we see him as an individual, not an instance representative of a group's worst traits taken as an inherent quality. And who is Wikus at the end of this? The guy that grew up in Johannesburg? A prawn? Well, now we've just stumbled into intersectionality and the progressive idea of whiteness and all that, haven't we? Shit. I'm going to need a bottle of scotch and a Newspeak dictionary if we're going to dive into this. Let's just leave it that Wikus is a case of a man becoming a prawn and a prawn that thinks like a man, leaving him as neither. The idea that race isn't entirely real is something for everyone to consider, and at the same time, there can be real conflicts between tribes or cultural blocks, whatever term you want to use. Sometimes irreconcilable conflicts that one way or another end up having to be fought out. It's just important not to conflate those ideas because they are often radically different things and can lead to acting against your own self-interest if you interpret them incorrectly. Or to put it in a personal context, most of my closest friends have been white men. Most of my bitterest enemies, also white men. And I learned long ago that I have a lot more in common with black small business owners and gig workers in the city than with white coastal academics, despite sometimes being mistaken for the latter. The bones are flying over today, so I don't know if they're on their way to Venezuela or what.